this computer. Okay. All right, we're recording now. Hello to all you who didn't come. Okay, so, all right, so here we go. So I do have a little something planned. It won't take very long, but basically we're going to do four things tonight. And again, we'll move through them fairly briskly. One is we'll just go over the exam format and the kinds of questions to expect. I'll give you a couple pointers. And then we're just going to do like a general overview of some of the major themes of the religions that we're going to be talking about in this class. And then the fourth thing we'll do is I'll just open it up to questions. So in other words, like I would recommend, if you don't already, like have the study guide up somewhere. No question is a stupid question. Just feel free to ask. And of course, just the one thing to be aware of is I think you already know, this is a review. It's not a comprehensive lecture. The best thing that we can do right now is basically just do an overview and answer some specific questions. And here's our other person coming in. Just as I thought. Hello, McKenna. We're recording, just as an FYI. Okay. All right, so let's begin. Well, actually, let me just ask briefly, are there any pressing questions, concerns, like right off the bat before I just jump in?
I just had a question. It wasn't specifically about this exam, but I was just wondering, are all the other exams formatted the same way? Or
Well, for better or for worse, this is the only exam in the class. I've actually considered making a final exam, but it won't be for y'all because it's not on the syllabus, so there won't be another. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. There will be a couple of short quizzes for homework assignments to give everyone kind of a break. But those will be very specific to videos that you watch and readings that you do. But there'll be like multiple choice, short answer kind of stuff for those quizzes. But yeah, but as far as large exams, this is it. And actually, I should just say briefly, I mean, the purpose of this exam, it's called the introductory or foundational exam, is basically so folks have some working knowledge of the basic theological concepts, philosophical concepts in this class, as well as some of just the major teachings of our religion, so that once we start to study our dilemmas like war, sexuality, the environment, stuff like that, that is not like all a mystery, you know? So this way everyone has the foundations, they kind of know the sacred text, the major beliefs to make sense of the theological, ethical teachings of these traditions. So that's why we're having an exam, basically, is to essentially force everyone. I'm not gonna like sugarcoat it. It's to force everybody to learn the material in preparation for studying the moral dilemmas. Hence why we really only have one exam in this class. Okay, so with that in mind, the format is the following. There are 50 multiple choice questions. It is open resource, meaning you can refer to the lectures, the books. I would not recommend going onto the internet because it's very confusing. So just as long as you stick to the lectures and the readings and the primary source documents, you'll be fine. So it's open resource and it is untimed, meaning that it's untimed. You can also pause the exam, walk around, take a break. The only issue with that is that I have had students who, like, you know, their computer crashes or, you know, the computer goes to sleep and never wakes up. So I would say if you can do it in one sitting, that would be advisable. All right, there are 3 different types of questions to expect on this multiple choice test. One I would just call straightforward multiple choice questions. So like, what is the Torah? You know, choice A, B, C, D, just like standard like definition questions. So expect quite a few of those. Second are quote questions. If there's one thing that you're going to learn in this class, I love my quotes from sacred texts. The reason why is because in order for us to really appreciate the complexity of religious teachings, we have to go to the source. And so for folks to recognize sacred text, to be able to interpret sacred text is really important. So basically, you're going to get a question like, analyze the following quote. And on the sixth day, God said, let us create humankind in our image, yada, yada, yada. The above quote comes from which of the following sacred texts? 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, D. Now, rest assured, I don't just go flipping through sacred texts and I'm like, okay, like test you on this one. All of them are either from the lectures or the primary source readings. And even if you didn't do the primary source readings, if you have a basic understanding of the religion, there's key words in there that will help you to identify what the quote is. So you will find a decent number of those as well. So make sure that you pay attention to the sacred text selections from the lectures and from the primary source documents. And then the last type of question, which is kind of the minority, you only have a handful of these, are what we might call critical thinking questions. So for example, you might get a question like, which of the following statements best summarizes the relationship between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? And so it's a critical thinking question because it's not straightforward, but basically it's based upon your adequate understanding of the traditions to interpret what the correct response is. So put simply, the majority of the questions are going to be your traditional straightforward definition questions, followed by these quote questions, followed by a few of these critical thinking questions. Any questions or concerns about the format? Okay. Now, I would say that probably the most important thing for you to know for this exam, from my perspective, are the sacred texts. The reason for that is because, again, as we start to delve into our theological, ethical teachings from these traditions, I will be constantly referring to sacred texts. So for example, like, what is the Buddhist stance on abortion? And I'll say, okay, well, this comes from the Tripitaka. This comes from, actually, Buddhism's a bad example because we really refer to the Tripitaka quite a bit. Let's see. What are Jewish attitudes concerning abortion? Well, here's a teaching from the Torah, and then here's a teaching from the Mishnah. So knowing the differences between the Torah and the Mishnah are kind of important to knowing the story behind the Jewish position on abortion. So whatever you do, make sure you know your sacred texts for the exam. So that's kind of the big thing to be aware of. Okay, the only other tip that I'll give you is the following: is if you haven't already done so, do yourself a favor and like fill out the study guide or have some kind of cheat sheet. The reason why is because if folks did no preparation for this exam, they probably would do fine. But it would probably take them, like I had a student once who was so mad at me, he was like, it took me 4 hours to do the exam. Like, how dare you like give us this assignment? And when I asked him, I said like, well, did you prepare for it? He said, no. And I was like, well, there you go. I mean, if you're going to go fishing, you're just going to make your life more difficult. So by preparing, it's not so much that the information isn't there. It's just, if it's really quick to have it, then, you can get it. Plus, if you work on the study guide, you're going to thank yourself for the rest of the course, because then you're going to actually have a little key guide, so that if you're doing the reading or you're writing a discussion forum and you're like, what is the Talmud again? It's like, where it is. Like, so it's a nice reference. So the more work you do now, the better the quality of your work will be later. Because again, I'll just tell you just very briefly, and then we'll move on. So sorry, I don't mean to belabor the point, but I can tell like who did the preparation for the exam later on in the course, just based upon the sophistication and the knowledge of the student, from this point in the semester. Like, I can tell you, like, when I'm grading like the war discussion forum, like I will know who really studied the Hinduism stuff and who didn't. So by all means, get the foundations done. You'll thank yourself later in the course. Okay, so that's it. Know your sacred text and just fill out the study guide, get a nice firm foundation now while you can. Okay, questions before I move on to the general overview?
I had a question. So,
Yes.
I actually started filling out the study guide. It ended up not saving on the Google sheet that I was filling it out on, so that all went away, which was really sad. But I tried to do as much as I did, filling it out from the last section that like with that you just posted, and I felt like there were a lot of things that I personally missed, and I wasn't sure if like I missed it because I wasn't looking hard enough, or if like it had been from previous lectures too. So I wanted to ask if we should definitely go back through all those, and then that will be written out. Like that will answer all the definitions for the rest of the terms,
Right.
aside from the ones from the last one.
Well, I'll tell you what, when we get to the question and answer, let's actually take a quick look at the end of the study guide, because it was designed in chronological order. So like whatever is coming toward the end of the study guide is going to be from this week. So let's take a quick look. Like let's see if we can find some of these mystery terms and where they might be located. All right, cool. All right, so here we go. So just a general overview. So I just want to go over a couple of motifs that might help us to get the bigger picture of the relationship of the religions that we're going to be studying, and help you to kind of take the terms that you've learned and kind of start to piece them kind of together into a broader picture. So here we go. So in this course, we are going to be focusing the majority of our attention upon 4 religious traditions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, with some Hinduism thrown in there in the war unit, because we're going to read the Bhagavad Gita, which is like crucial to understanding religious attitudes on war. And we're going to talk about caste issues in the economic justice unit. But again, primarily, we're going to stick with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, with a little Hinduism smattered in there. So let's start with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, just a general overview of these religious traditions. So first of all, I don't know if anyone has ever heard of this term, but Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are often referred to as what are called the Abrahamic traditions. Now, that is a problematic term that in itself can be critiqued, but nevertheless, that is a common term that is used. The reason for this is for 2 reasons. One is that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they tend to trace what we call like their prophetic lineage back to the prophet Abraham. That is, Abraham was this dude who lived in ancient Mesopotamia in this polytheistic society. And it is believed in the Jewish and Christian and Islamic traditions that Abraham was the first man to break from the polytheistic traditions to then found a kind of monotheistic tradition. So, in other words, these traditions believe in a prophetic tradition of these people who communicated with God. And the first of these was Abraham, or the first, well, that's arguable. Anyway, the first true one, I guess you could say, was Abraham. And they all kind of trace their lineage back to him. So that's the first reason. And then the second reason is that Jews, Christians, and Muslims tend to, or at least there's this common attitude that they all believe in the same God. That is, they all believe in the same single God that Abraham worshiped, right? The God of Abraham. Now, again, that is problematic because there's a lot of variation in theology in these traditions, but nevertheless, that's kind of the understanding. So again, these 3 traditions, they kind of, they all, let's see, they all adhere to this tradition of these prophets who communicated with God going back to Abraham. And of course, Islam and Christianity also kind of respect, I guess you could say, the prophetic tradition of Judaism in the what Christians refer to as the Old Testament and the Bible. And as a result of that, there are some common motifs, and probably the biggest overarching motif is the following. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all believe in 3 things. 1, that there exists one God who created the universe. 2, that at one point human beings lived or existed in what is called Eden, or this kind of paradisial place where there's no death, where there's no famine, where there's perpetual peace, and humanity lives in close proximity to the Creator God. And the third thing is that human beings fell from grace. That is, they were booted out of the Garden of Eden or out of paradise and are now living in this miserable world called Earth. And the desire of humanity is to go back to Eden. That is, again, at one point, humanity lived in this paradisial place. There was no death, there was no misery, there was plenty of food. Human beings have fallen from that paradise, and we want to go back to it. So what does that mean, to go back to Eden? Well, there's variation in these three traditions, but the general understanding is twofold. One is that the ultimate goal of human life is to achieve some kind of an afterlife. That is, when human beings die and they live a particular kind of pious life, that they will return to Eden in the afterlife. There'll be some kind of an immortality where there will be no more death or dying or suffering or disease or anything like that. But the second thing that this means as well, and this is particularly prominent in the Jewish tradition, is that when human beings live according to a particular kind of religious and ethical life, that somehow they're going to bring Eden down to earth. So in other words, if human beings behave in a certain way, they will receive the grace of God, and therefore life in this world will somehow improve and come close to the world in which Eden, that kind of characterizes Eden. So again, what do all of these kind of traditions have in common? That is Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Again, this idea that there exists this all-powerful God that created the universe, that at one point humanity existed in this paradisial place of peace, that humanity fell from that and wants to go back to that place. And either that means seeking an afterlife of immortality in a kind of Eden or paradise, or somehow bringing the paradise down to earth through just and ethical behavior. And that latter is particularly prevalent in the Jewish tradition. Questions or concerns about that overarching motif with these three traditions? Okay. And again, these are like broad strokes. Again, remember, like Matthews was saying, right, in our textbook, that like the chapters on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are dangerous because like they're so general that like it makes it seem like these traditions are, you know, unidimensional and straightforward, whereas they're really diverse. There's a great deal of variation, even within the traditions themselves. Okay, and lastly, the overarching motif of Buddhism and Hinduism. So first of all, and this of course was revealed in the lectures, Buddhism came out of the Hindu tradition. That is, the historical Buddha is believed to have been raised as a Hindu, and therefore there are some commonalities between the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition. The most important similarity between Buddhism and Hinduism is in terms of the belief in reincarnation. That is, the Hindu and the Buddhist traditions both advocate this idea that when we die, that we will be reborn again on this earth to live another lifetime. And according to the Buddhist tradition in particular, all living things, animals, plants, human beings, we are on this wheel of reincarnation called samsara, and we will be on this wheel of reincarnation for eternity, that is going to keep going and going and going and going. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but when I was raised, there were some people in my family who believed in reincarnation. And I was raised to believe that reincarnation was a good thing. It was like, well, if I had to choose between eternal darkness and living another life, like I'd much rather live another life. You know, it's like, you get another shot and, you know, at least you're conscious and, you know, you get to live again. But believe it or not, in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions, reincarnation is not necessarily regarded as a good thing. That is, believe it or not, the goal of Hinduism and Buddhism is to get off of the wheel of reincarnation. Okay, why is that the case? Well, if anyone here has ever been nauseous, like I hate being sick, like I hate like throwing up, like it's like the worst thing in the world for me. Like I probably would much rather break a bone. I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't jinx myself. But anyway, so imagine being sick, like nauseous, an infinite number of times, like over and over and over again, or like, you know, having back problems, getting old, having the flu, like over and over and over again. It's like, why would you want to go through that time and time again? You know, it's kind of like usually when I teach this class in person, I'm like, who here likes roller coasters? And usually half the class like raises their hand. And I'm like, imagine going on the same roller coaster an infinite number of times. And it's like, people are like, yeah, after a while they get sick of it. Like they don't want to do it anymore. So that's kind of the logic behind reincarnation is it's like after a while, the soul or the consciousness just wants to get off the cycle of reincarnation. So in both the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, to do that, they have devised, or they've developed rather, meditation practices that are designed to kind of elevate the soul or the mind beyond this reality so that the soul or the consciousness is ready to kind of leave the body, you know, after death. And in order to practice meditation effectively, one has to live a good moral life. That is, Buddhism in particular makes this connection. It says, if you want to meditate effectively, then you have to live according to what are called the Buddhist precepts of like nonviolence, not committing any sexual misconduct or anything like that. There's this connection between sound mindfulness and morality. And so, again, in order to get off the wheel of reincarnation, moral behavior, as well as these kind of meditation or mindfulness practices. Now, when we read the Bhagavad Gita, we're going to find that there are several other practices that are kind of marketed, I suppose you could say, that will lead to kind of salvation and getting off the wheel of reincarnation, but we'll learn more about that later. But one thing to be, for you to be aware for this exam, however, is that one of the ways that one can get off the cycle of reincarnation that is emphasized in the Bhagavad Gita and later the laws of Manu in the Hindu tradition are caste duties. That is this, there's this idea in the Hindu tradition that God created the caste system, and that if human beings adhere to their caste duties, that can also lead to salvation. Now, Buddhism rejects the caste system, but Hinduism, up until this day, that theology is still very much alive in that tradition. So again, in conclusion, for the Abrahamic traditions, again, this idea of the goal of life being returning to paradise by living a particularly pious life. And for the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, is getting off the wheel of reincarnation through certain moral and mindfulness meditation practices. All right, so that is the broad overview of these religious traditions. Questions about what we discussed before we go into more specific questions from the content? All right. Well, let's take a moment. Whoops, no, I don't want to. Oh, I can't minimize the thing. Okay, fine. Okay. Sorry, I never knew I couldn't minimize the Zoom. Oh no, does that mean I can't look up the study guide? I suppose I could stop recording. Well, I'll tell you what, let's first ask some questions, and then if I have to look it up, I'll stop the recording and we'll take it from there. In the meantime, actually, I can see the study guide, so let me see here. Okay, gotcha. All right. Well, I'll tell you what, here, let me jump into this because since Zoe, is it Zoe or Zoe?
It's funny you say that because my name's actually it's Greek and it's pronounced Zoe, but go by Zoe because nobody really knows how to pronounce it.
Oh, okay, all right. Right, yeah, it means life in Greek. Yeah, I know that. I know that. Okay, so well here, let me
Professor,
yeah, go ahead,
I,
Rex.
I was wondering, how do you say your name, your last name?
You
I've
want to
been
give it a shot?
wondering that.
You want to give it a shot? I dare you.
Honestly, I don't even know if I could, even if I wanted to.
It's well, the American pronunciation is Hair Asimchuk. If we were in Ukraine, it would be Herosimchuk, but we're not in Ukraine. Interestingly, sometimes when people make the attempt, they pronounce it in the Ukrainian way, and I'm like, bravo, like you got the original pronunciation. But yeah, you can just call me Professor Age. That's perfectly fine. So here, let me share my screen real quick so I can address Zoe's question. Let's see if I can grab it here. Oh boy, weird. Can you see my screen right now? This one part went all gray and I don't really know why. Okay, whatever.
We can see it.
Okay, good. So yep, on the final page, all of these terms, samsara, moksha, Brahman, Atman, are these kind of the ones that you're referring to? Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So all of these you're going to find in the in the Buddhism and Hinduism lectures. So like oh right, because that's right. Matthews doesn't talk about Hinduism. So right, so I had to send the chapter. Yeah, for Hinduism, I would say basically stick to the lectures. Like I guess Buddhism for that matter too. Our text on Buddhism is great, but the chapters are a little advanced for for the introductory stuff. I mean, read them by all means, but I would say maybe start with the lectures on Buddhism first, and then take a look at the Kiaun text, because then I think it'll make more sense. So yep, so all of these you're going to find in particular the Buddhism stuff. With the exception of this, the parable of the burning house. The parable of the burning house is a selection from the primary sources. And if we have time, I can give like a brief, little summary because it's kind of a fun text. But yep, so yeah, all these you'll find in the lectures. So I would go to the lectures first and then go back to the readings.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a quick question too.
Yes.
So I was filling out the study guide and I didn't like watch the lectures yet that were posted yesterday. So I just wanted to know if these terms were in there too. It's the ones after the New Testament. There's like a few before like the theology. I just didn't know. I don't think those were a part of like the Judaism or Christianity, right?
Gotcha. Okay. All right. I think I know what you're saying. Wait, so let's see here.
I would try and pronounce them, but like I don't really know.
Wait, do you mean theology, revelation theology, natural theology, like those things? Or are you
No, they're right above like the term section. They're underneath, like they're sacred text.
Oh, sacred text. Oh, okay.
Yeah. The one that starts with a Q, like a few of those.
Oh, you mean the Quran, the Hadith, Sharia. Oh, yes, yeah, okay, yes. So rest assured that yes, those terms are going to be in this week's lectures. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Yes, indeed. Yep, the Quran, the Hadith, those are Islamic texts, and then all the others are Hindu and Buddhist texts.
Perfect. Thank you.
Of course. Keep on trying to minimize the screen. I mean, it's not letting me. I'm sorry. It's just. Any questions about any of the I mean, some of the foundational stuff was kind of tricky. I don't know if there were any questions about that, or seriously, even if there's just one term, you're just like, hey, can you say more about this? But no rush. We have time, so take a few minutes and take a look. or a minute. I'll take a look.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
So as before you mentioned, obviously it's really important to prepare and like know the sacred texts. Meaning just the ones that we referred to in class and in the lectures, right? Like you don't want us to independently like research them, or are those okay?
Yeah, no, the ones from this class are perfectly fine. They're kind of like the major texts. Yeah, they're the major ones. So but a good question nonetheless, because you're right, like texts and traditions are voluminous, so that makes sense.
Thank you.
Of course. McKenna, any questions or anything?
Not yet. Just,
Oh, okay.
just kind of listening.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Just gonna take a quick look here.
What do what area of the study guide do most students have like difficulty with usually? Is there any area that like you would recommend?
Yeah, sure. Actually, yeah, that's a good question. I know the answer in my mind already, but I'm giving it some just giving it some thought. Okay, so I would say that probably the tradition in general that most students grapple with. I mean, I find that most students are fascinated with Buddhism, but they're also grapple with it because many of the teachings of Buddhism are counterintuitive, especially to folks who may have grown up in the Jewish or Christian traditions. The reason why is because there are two doctrines in Buddhism which kind of throw people from Jewish and Christian backgrounds for a loop. And that is what is called anicca and anatman. Anicca is the idea that there does not exist a creator God. So although Buddhist texts in the tradition do believe in the existence of gods, they do not believe in the existence of a supreme being, like a creator God. Rather, in the Buddhist tradition, if we had a time machine and we want to go back to the origin of the universe, there would be no origin of the universe. It would just keep going back and back and back in time to infinity. And so existence is basically this infinite cycle of birth and redeath that just goes on forever, and yeah, it doesn't end. There's also this concept, what is called anatman, meaning no self or no ego or no soul. That is, according to the Buddhist tradition, there's no such thing as a self. So the fact that you're calling me Professor H or Alex is an illusion. That is, if you were to talk to me when I was 5 years old, you would notice that I'm very different than the person I am now, and I'll probably be very different from the person I am than when I'm 65 years old. So like, in other words, like there's nothing stable about us that like remains the same throughout our lifetime, but we're just like constantly changing. Like our lives are almost like sand that goes through our fingers. It's just like, there's nothing constant about us. And so as a result, they're like, well, don't attach yourself to yourself. Don't attach yourself to things, because nothing in this world is permanent. Nothing in this world is stable. And the very concept of selfishness doesn't make any sense, because there is no self. Like, how can you love yourself when the self doesn't exist? So that tends to throw people. Now, don't get worried. People are like, oh my God, like, there's no self. How are we supposed to make sense of this? But yeah, but figure this, like in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Hinduism, there's this idea that there's a creator God, and that we all have a soul that's permanent, that's kind of remains with us through our lifetime and even into the afterlife, if there's a belief in one. And so it is difficult to kind of for people to wrap their heads around these concepts of anicca and anatman. But to be honest with you, like anatman is central to the Buddhist worldview. Because just to give you a preview, if you haven't watched the lectures yet, Buddhists believe that the path to salvation, to get off of the wheel of birth and death, is to practice non-attachment. That is to not be attached to your desires, yourself, material things, thoughts and feelings. It's to basically let them go. And so what gives that idea legitimacy is this idea that nothing in the world is permanent. And so just let them go, you know? So yeah. So a long-winded response to your question, Rex, is that the Buddhist tradition is usually what folks tend to be both intrigued by, but also grapple with, because it's quite counterintuitive from our standards, I guess you could say, in the West. Good question. You got me all excited. That must be a good question. All right, so we have a couple more minutes left. So you just take a few seconds, just give the study guide another glaze through, and we'll see if anyone comes up with anything.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
I was going through like the study guide and like taking the notes I had from the lectures. So I understand like the divine command theory, but then there was the terms divine law and natural law. So is the divine law just basically like what they were saying, the divine command theory, like that God creates this like universal moral law of like what's good and what's evil? And then what would like the natural law be? Just like,
Very good. Yeah. So first of all, yes, a lot of these terms, it's interesting how, like, even though this is a course on comparative religious ethics, religious studies is inevitably grounded in particular, the Christian tradition. And in the Christian tradition, there's this idea that God communicates to humanity in two different ways. One is through revelation, where God reveals specific rules and stuff, as you mentioned, like concerning what is right and wrong, and how to be pious and all that stuff. But that God also communicates to human beings through God's creation. Trying to think of a good example here. There's an example I know, but I don't want to use it right now. I don't want to give anything away, or that particular thing away in the class. Let me think here. Okay, well, this is not a very good example, but here's a runner-up. Certain theologians who are pro-environmentalism, they will say, like, see, look, like God like created like the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle, and if we just left things alone, like God would take care of us, you know, like there's this, like we should observe the natural world, learn from it, and learn to live in harmony with it. And so there's kind of this idea that God's natural law, like God has kind of fixed a certain law in the world, and nature should function in a certain way. And when we observe it and learn from it, we ought to kind of mimic or like be in harmony with it. And so not only does God kind of teach us to live in accordance with specific rules, you know, through revelation, but also to learn from the natural order of things and to live in harmony with it. And so, yeah, so in other words, God's divine commands come from like two different sources, from the law, but also from the natural world.
okay, thank you.
Good question. No, that's a very good question.
Thank you.
I also have a question.
McKenna, yes, please.
Sorry, I'm at the doctor's office, so I'm just kind of like listening in. Before you talked about how we need to know like quotes and stuff. So let's say, for instance, it's on, I'm gonna give a random one from here. Let's say it's on a person. So
Yeah.
like Abraham, for instance. So maybe know who he is, and then like and obviously I'm not gonna like memorize quotes here, but like know kind of like what section of the book he's in that like you can be able to find this?
Yeah, you'll get two different quote questions. One is you'll get, right, like what text does this come from?
Okay.
Another one you will get to is kind of like, this episode is like from the life of who? Because we studied like the life of Buddha, the life of Jesus of Nazareth, the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And so there are certain quotes, that are in the presentations that you'll, but also certain like indications of like events from their life. Like, so in other words, yeah, definitely watch like the bios of those three religious figures. Because like, for example, I'll just give you a freebie and just say, like, for example, like Buddha, when he experiences the four sights, like expect to find his experience when he encounters the four sights like as a quote. But
Okay.
once you see the quote and if you understand like the life of Buddha, like you'll put the two and two together.
Okay. So like it won't be like a shock of what it is. Like you'll know if you like prepare.
Exactly. So like,
Okay.
so whether you know the life of the figure or it's directly from the presentations, you'll know it.
Okay. Thank you.
Good. Yep. Very good. Again, I think this is the most questions I've ever had of a review. Usually it's like, okay, see you later. But like, I was like, wow, like, good question. Anything else? Okie dokie. Well, thank you everyone very much. This was actually quite a satisfying review. I have no regrets. Okay, folks. So, well, good luck this week. If you have any further questions, something comes up, just feel free to email me. And thank you for agreeing to be recorded. Everyone looks great. And have a good night, everyone, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very
night,
much.
thank you.
Okay, good
Bye.
night.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good night.
All right, you too, good night.
Have a good weekend.